So I want to talk about the recent Trump administration actions with regards to impoundment, but before I do so, two quick things. One, I'm quite awkward about being on camera, so if I act awkwardly or look away from the camera or anything of the sort, please try to bear with me. I'm just not used to this. And secondly, I'll put it out there, I'm not a legal expert by any means, so all of this is just me trying to look into all of these things in as good faith as I possibly could. But for the sake of epistemic humility, I'll put that out there and say that I could be wrong, especially with regards to legal cases that I looked into that regard this case. So, with that out of the way, let's get into what actually happened. So, on January 27th, there was a memo sent out by the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, that was sent out to just over 2,600 different agencies, alerting them to the fact that funds that are allocated to them by Congress will now have a freeze put on them by the executive branch. This caused much concern, both for people within these agencies, as well as from the media, as well as from legal experts. And one concern was about how current ongoing operations of different bodies that rely on this funding are going to be affected. So, for example, many researchers that rely on federal funding talked about how with this freeze, they're unsure about what's going to be the future of their research and whether they're actually going to be able to carry out the research, and they don't know quite what to do with these researchers and the researches as they're still ongoing and they're in the middle of them. And additionally, there was also concern from many in the population about whether or not this will affect things that directly affect citizens. So the latter concern was clarified the next day on the 28th with an additional memorandum in which the administration, the OMB, laid out specifically that anything regarding direct assistance, which means something like Medicare or food stamps, is not going to be affected by this freeze. This nonetheless still poses a huge concern, and legal experts agree with this as well, and this is why attorney generals of 22 different states, as well as the Attorney General of DC, took issue with this and decided to challenge the Trump administration's actions in court. And following this, on the 29th, the administration and the OMB specifically sent out another memo, essentially rescinding the original memo of the 27th. However, very important to note, the press secretary of the White House came out and stated that while the memo has been rescinded, the policy enacted within it has not, meaning that they rescind the memo itself, but anything that was laid out in it is still in effect. And this seems to also be the reality on the ground, given that many people within said agencies have stated that they still do not have the access to the funds that are supposed to be allocated to them by Congress, and those funds are still frozen. So now that we understand what has happened, let's talk about, is this at all legal? Is there any legal grounding that Trump could use to actually do this action legally? So whenever I initially saw this, and if you're someone watching this and you have not really looked into this or anything of the sort, you might also think, well, maybe this is something normal whenever an administration changes. Maybe there are some freezes that are done for the administration to examine whether they support these actions, anything of the sort. So it seems from what I was able to discern from many different civil servants that have been within these agencies for years upon years, this is normal to an extent. It's normal, according to them, that for about a day, whenever an administration changes, there's some delay in funds to different agencies as the new administration gets in place and all of these sorts of things. They're just normal delays that end up occurring. However, it seems very different from my understanding, both due to the fact that there was a memorandum sent out with specific intent to freeze these funds, rather than just there being some delays due to some kind of people changing, getting accustomed to a new position, all these different things. This seems to have been an intentional freeze. And additionally, on top of that, there's also the fact that this freeze was for more than just a day. It was initially not intended to be for a day, it was indefinite. There was no date stated in the initial memorandum for how long this freeze is going to be going on for. So when we look at that, we have to ask ourselves, so is there actually anything that, can the president decide that he does not want federal money going into different agencies? So for that, we need to look at, one, the fact that in the Constitution, Congress itself is vested, and Congress is meaning the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. Congress is vested with the power of the purse, meaning they control the budget, they control all of these different things with regards to essentially the wallet of the United States. And however, there was an act passed in 1974 called the Impoundment Act, in short, and that act essentially governs just how Congress is supposed to govern this process of getting at the budget. And within it, there are two different sections that do lay out, or carve out rather, an exception where the president does have the ability to freeze certain funding. So these sections are called Section 1012 and 1013, and both these sections essentially lay out that, and I'll fully admit I didn't quite understand the difference, but besides the fact that one of these, I believe 1012, also made carve-outs for other executive powers to do this as well, and not just the president himself. But nonetheless, both of these sections lay out a scenario where if the president wants to put a freeze on different federal spending as is laid out in the budget by Congress, he does have the ability to do so under the condition that he sends out what is referred to as a special message in both these sections, in which he details essentially why he wants this freeze, how long this freeze is going to be for, what the effect of the freeze is going to be, and things of the sort. So very important to note that both of these sections that could be possible arguments that the government could, or rather that specifically the administration, insofar as the executive branch, could rely on as to why they were able to do this, both of these sections say that this is under the condition of having sent out this special message to Congress, which the administration, not only is there no evidence that they did this, from my research into it, it doesn't even seem like they're claiming they have done this whatsoever. But even outside of that, in these sections, essentially, after the special message is sent out, Congress has 45 days to decide to shut it down or to approve it. If Congress does not decide to approve it within those 45 days, those funds have to be unfrozen, and the executive branch has to allocate them as Congress initially decided in its budget. So, when we look at that, it seems pretty clear that Trump did not follow the process laid out in both these different sections, as again, there was no special message sent out whatsoever. I watched a debate regarding the impoundment, in which a side that, from my understanding, because I don't want to misrepresent the guy specifically who said this, from my understanding, this guy said that while it's not good, the courts should be the one challenging it, and it does not pose a constitutional threat, the fact that Trump did this, and he specifically referred to how Section 1013 has been essentially nullified by a case, in a case called New Haven versus the United States. So, me being the nerd that I am, I decided I want to look into that and see, does this case actually give Trump more validity to do what he did, or anything of the sort? And essentially, I lay out the general background details of the case. Essentially, in the case of New Haven versus the United States, it was, I believe, in 87, if I remember correctly, but it was around the late 80s when Reagan was in power. Reagan's administration wanted to freeze funding for 4 specific programs under the HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development Agency, and they attempted to freeze the funding for these agencies, and the city of New Haven, being one of the cities that was supposed to be affected by one of these programs, decided to challenge this move and take it to court. And important to note, from my memory at the very least, Reagan did actually send out a special message to Congress to approve this at the time. However, the decision of the courts in this case was that essentially, while Section 1013 does lay out a possibility for the president to decide to freeze these funds and for Congress to then approve it, this is essentially unconstitutional. The reasoning that they gave essentially sums down to the fact that that Congress intervening with executive functions, which are the functions of these different agencies, essentially means that they are branching outside of what is supposed to be their power in the Constitution. And for this, they relied on a previous case known as, and I apologize if I'm butchering the name, Chadha versus the INS. And I'll get into that one in a little bit. But essentially, what they said is that because of this, basically, Congress does not have the ability to give such a veto. The veto itself is unconstitutional. But that then poses a problem, because if Congress does not have the ability to pose such a veto, does that mean that if we just cancel that, that would mean, that the president just has the ability to freeze whatever funds he wants for whatever reason he wants, and Congress does not have the ability to stop it. So whenever trying to analyze that, the court decided that they need to look at what was the initial intent of the people who wrote the law, and they essentially came to the conclusion that the people writing the law, if they understood that such a veto power would be unconstitutional, they would not to begin with even give the president the power to freeze such funds, as if the veto power is the only thing that would be dismissed, president can just, like I said, freeze whatever funds he wants without anyone to answer to, really. So the decision was essentially that all of Section 1013 is completely void because of the unconstitutional veto laid within it. So the president does not have, under that section, the ability to decide to freeze funds. So they referred within this to another case, as I said, known as Chadha versus the INS, which again, apologies if I'm butchering the name. But in that case, essentially, someone who was a foreign exchange student from Kenya was rendered stateless due to the fact that he came from Kenya, and when he was in Kenya, it was still a British colony, but at the point where he was already in the United States, Kenya declared independence, and because both the United Kingdom as well as Kenya did not recognize him as their citizen, he was then rendered, as I said, stateless. And the United States wanted to deport him as he was just a foreign exchange student and his time in the United States has lapsed. And he tried to protest that while trying to appeal to a statute that states that essentially the Attorney General has the power to decide for someone who has been in the United States for 7 years or more to stop the deportation proceedings for such a person if such deportation proceedings were to the discretion of the Attorney General, something that would be extremely difficult to actually carry out. So we tried to rely on the principle of that statute to appeal to this, and essentially the INS, which is the agency that was supposed to carry out his deportation, sent out his request to Congress. Congress then decided to actually approve his claim and state that he should not be deported due to this, and but the INS decided to challenge that decision and took it to court. And the court decided that essentially, due to the fact that the INS is an executive, and it is under the executive branch, Congress itself does not have the ability to unilaterally decide on the actions of that branch, and therefore Congress's decision does not matter, and they don't have the power to intervene with this. So this entire case was basically just used as a basis to state why in the case of New Haven versus the U.S., different federal agencies are supposed to allow to function, and Congress does not have the ability to intervene within the functions of said agencies. But as I stated already, this poses a danger, because then that just means that if we do follow the rest of Section 1013, it would mean President has an unchecked power. So to check said power, the President just does not have the ability to freeze it to begin with, and nor does Congress to veto such a thing. I'm not quite clear on why this is only applied to Section 1013 and not 1012. It's possible that this was just the section that was appealed to in this case, and that's why this is used as this. But nonetheless, this means that even any legal justification that could be used by the administration for why what they're doing is legal is in itself kind of on shaky ground, as there's precedent establishing the fact that the president should not have the power to do that nonetheless, even if he did send out a special message, which, as stated, he did not. So this leaves us in a very scary position where essentially the Trump administration did something that they clearly have no legal standing to do, and it seems pretty clear that different courts agree with this as well. And it's quite scary that they seem to, despite having rescinded the initial memorandum, still state that they were going to still carry out the policy within said memorandum. And for anyone who's like, why should I care about this or anything of the sort, one, this does affect, as I said, different agencies that are affected by federal spending. But even outside of that, I think a lot more importantly is the fact that this is a continued erosion of democracy by the Trump administration. And I think that another very important thing to point out is the fact that while the Trump administration is claiming that this is just a move from them to, as they're trying to do with the establishment of Doge, just to try to seek out different government waste and fraud and all these different things, they actually have an agenda leading them to do these things. And for that, I'd point to the fact that the initial memorandum also laid out that they wanted these different agencies to give a report by February 5th as to whether any of the programs or activities that they carry out within them have anything motivated by what is known as DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, or if they're trying to promote abortion or transgender agenda or anything of the sort, which leads me to believe that this freeze on these different agencies was not merely a thing of we think that there's waste or fraud there, but rather because they think that the actions carried out by these agencies are not something that they support and they want money allocated to. So again, this is important because whether you agree with what these agencies are doing or not, the president should not have the power to do these things. Even if you think that these agencies are actually carrying out programs that they're not supposed to be carrying out, great. This is supposed to be within Congress's jurisdiction to pass laws and all these different things. Or for, again, if we want to rely on Section 1012 or 1013, even though, again, 1013 is a little bit shaky ground, even if we want to rely on that, there needs to be a special message sent out, and this needs to be approved by Congress. Otherwise, the president cannot unilaterally do this. And this is just a furthering of the consolidation of powers into the executive branch and the push that the Trump administration has been making to consolidate all powers, as was laid out in Project 2025, which, if you don't know, was a paper laid out by the Heritage Foundation, which is a very well-known conservative think tank that came out with a bunch of different policies that they would want the administration to enact if Trump gets in power, which he did. The Trump administration constantly tried to distance himself from this paper, but seemingly are following one of the most scary tenets that was laid out in that paper, that being the consolidation of powers, as well as firing different civil servants, which are positions that are not supposed to be politicized. Civil servants within these different agencies are supposed to be positions that remain, and the people within them remain regardless of who's the president. But we see that the Trump administration seems to be continuously trying to fire people within these agencies, and again, freeze their funding and all these different things to stop actions that they don't politically agree with. Which, again, whether you agree with or not that these are things that you don't like, the president should not have the power to do this. And I think it's a pretty simple argument to make that also, even if you like what Trump is doing right now, you need to realize that this sets a certain precedent, and once Trump is out of office, if there ever is a Democrat in power ever again, and I'm not saying that in a hysterical way of like, oh, there will never be any Democrat because he'll be anti-democratic, although that's definitely a possibility, just that any Democrat that ever takes office as president following this can now have this precedent to rely on and just freeze funding for anything that they themselves don't like for ideological reasons. So they can stop anything that a Republican might like ideologically because they just don't agree with it and they don't have anyone really to answer to if we go along with this. And like I said, this is quite scary because it's a complete erosion of the democracy of the United States. And as someone who does not live in the United States, I think this is still incredibly important because the United States does have quite a huge power internationally. And the fact is that whether you like it or not, even if you think the United States should not be intervening, even if you're someone who's like anti-interventionist and think the United States should just take care of its own citizens and all these things, reality is that right now there's not any other power that would take over for the United States for this, which just means that the international community would just be left without any real any real body that takes care of these things. There would just be a vacuum of power there. So again, even if you don't like the idea that the United States is in charge of all these things, removing them as the body that currently does this without having any sort of replacement in place is really, really, to be kind, idiotic, because it just leaves it so that there's no checks and balances, nobody that the international community has to answer to in cases like, for example, Ukraine or Russia. There's no body that can intervene in that or anything like that, besides more localized things like NATO or the EU. So even if you're not American, again, this should concern you because this will affect you whether you like it or not. And even if you agree with everything Trump is doing right now, this means that the next president could come in and just over time, the erosion of the democracy of the United States likely will, and we seem to have been seeing this over time, means that the international community just does not take the United States seriously as a global superpower, and that just means that we don't have any power in place to replace them. So there's nobody to govern any of these things. Now, ideally, I would say that the United States, again, especially given the fact that Trump has been elected after all of January 6th and all of these different things, should not be trusted, has shown itself to not be trustworthy, sadly. And I would have loved it if a body like the United Nations would be able to take over, but in its current formation, it's not nearly as trusted and followed and respected as much as the United States is, meaning that, again, the erosion of democracy in the United States just leaves everyone in chaos. And sorry to end it in such a gloomy note, but yeah, just my main point is that whether you like Trump or not, moves like this are eroding democracy, and this should be a thing that greatly concerns everyone, regardless of your political persuasion. So yeah, I don't quite know what to say from here, so I guess if you watched so far, thank you, and bye.